She was locked in a tower for 15 years. No court, no throne, no army. Her husband held the keys, controlled the guards, controlled everything. And yet, from inside that prison, Eleanor of Aquitaine dismantled his kingdom, piece by piece, turned his own sons into weapons, and eventually walked out of that tower more powerful than when she walked in. Most people think prison ends a reign. Eleanor used hers to start one. Before we go inside that tower, drop a comment with your city and country, because once you understand what Eleanor actually did from inside 4 stone walls, you will never again confuse imprisonment with defeat. To understand why a king locked his own queen in a tower, you have to understand what Eleanor of Aquitaine was before she became his prisoner. She wasn't just a queen, she was a sovereign. Born around 1122 in southern France, Eleanor inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine at 15 when her father died. Aquitaine wasn't a minor title. It was one of the largest and wealthiest territories in France, bigger than the French king's own domain. Eleanor didn't inherit land, she inherited power, real power, the kind that came with armies and courts and the absolute right to rule. She was 15 years old, and she was already more powerful than most men would ever be. Louis the Fat moved fast. He saw a 15-year-old duchess with more land than he controlled, and did what medieval kings did. He arranged a marriage. His son, Louis the Young, married Eleanor within weeks of her father's death. Eleanor went from Duchess of Aquitaine to Queen of France in a single summer. She was still 15. And from the beginning, the marriage was wrong. Louis the Young was pious, careful, timid. Eleanor was brilliant, outspoken, and magnetic. She attended his council meetings. She offered opinions. She argued with bishops. Medieval France was horrified. Queens were not supposed to think out loud. She went on the Second Crusade. That alone should tell you everything about who Eleanor was. In 1147, when Louis the Young led his armies toward Jerusalem, Eleanor didn't stay home and pray. She went. She brought her own knights, her own ladies, her own court. She rode. Ancient chronicles describe her in armor, on horseback, commanding her own contingent of Aquitanian soldiers. Whether every detail is accurate or legend is irrelevant. What's certain is that Eleanor of Aquitaine was physically present on a crusade at a time when women were expected to remain invisible. And what happened on that crusade broke the marriage permanently. The specifics are disputed. Some say Eleanor grew too close to her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, spent too many private hours in his company, showed too much comfort around a man who wasn't her husband. Louis the Young was furious. He accused her. She demanded an annulment. He refused and had her physically removed from Antioch at night, carried out of the city against her will. Eleanor never forgot that. Being physically dragged away from somewhere she chose to be, being removed, being controlled, she filed that memory away. And when they returned to France, the marriage was finished in everything but name. The annulment came in 1152. Louis the Young kept her lands, or tried to. The agreement stated Aquitaine returned to Eleanor's control, which meant the moment she walked out of her French marriage, she walked back into being one of the most powerful landowners in Europe. She was 30 years old. She had survived a crusade, a failing marriage, and a king who tried to erase her. And within 8 weeks of her annulment, Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry Plantagenet. He was 19. She was 30. She chose him. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. Henry Plantagenet became King of England in 1154. Eleanor became Queen of England. Together, their combined territories stretched from Scotland's border to the Pyrenees Mountains. The Angevin Empire, larger than France, larger than anything Western Europe had seen since Charlemagne. Eleanor wasn't just queen consort, a decorative title beside a powerful man. She governed. When Henry Plantagenet was occupied elsewhere, Eleanor held court. She issued charters. She administered justice. She presided over the most sophisticated cultural court in Europe, the court that gave birth to the troubadour tradition, to Arthurian legend, to the concept of chivalric love. She wasn't the woman behind the throne. She was a throne herself. And she gave Henry Plantagenet children, 8 of them, 5 sons, 3 daughters. Among those sons, Richard the Lionheart, who would become King of England, John Lackland, who would become the king who signed Magna Carta, Geoffrey, who would rule Brittany, Henry the young king, who was crowned in his father's lifetime. But their firstborn son, William, had died in childhood. Eleanor built the next generation of European monarchy inside her own body. And then she watched Henry Plantagenet throw it all away. Not the kingdom, the marriage, the trust, the basic dignity that even medieval queens were supposed to receive. Henry Plantagenet took a mistress. Her name was Rosamond Clifford. Fair Rosamond, they called her. Young, beautiful, completely devoted. Henry Plantagenet didn't hide her. He paraded her. He installed her. He let the whole court watch. Medieval kings took mistresses. Eleanor knew this. She was worldly enough not to be naive about it. But Henry Plantagenet didn't keep Rosamond discreet the way convention demanded. He elevated her. He humiliated Eleanor deliberately, publicly, in a way that went beyond pragmatic infidelity into something personal, something designed to diminish. And Eleanor understood exactly what he was doing and exactly why. He wanted Aquitaine. He'd always wanted Aquitaine. And Eleanor controlled Aquitaine. The only way to break that control was to break Eleanor. So Eleanor did something that no medieval queen had ever done before, and almost none would do after. She left. In 1173, Eleanor of Aquitaine left Henry Plantagenet's court and returned to Aquitaine. She installed herself in Poitiers, in her own court, surrounded by her own people, living by her own rules. And from Poitiers, she did something that should have been impossible. She turned Henry Plantagenet's sons against him. Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey. Eleanor worked on each of them. She reminded them what their father had taken from them, titles promised and withheld, lands granted and then controlled, sons who were kings in name but not in power. Eleanor fed that resentment carefully, precisely, the way a strategist feeds a fire. In 1173, the Great Revolt began. Henry Plantagenet's own sons, led by Henry the young king, supported by Richard the Lionheart and Geoffrey, rose against their father. Eleanor was the architect. The French king supported the rebellion. Scottish forces attacked from the north. Flemish mercenaries crossed the Channel. Henry Plantagenet found himself fighting a war on every border simultaneously, while his own sons led the charge from inside. This wasn't a rebellion. This was Eleanor's revenge, organized, financed, and directed from her court in Poitiers. Henry Plantagenet was a brilliant military commander. He crushed it. One by one, the fronts collapsed. His sons surrendered, and Henry Plantagenet began looking for the person at the center of the web. He found Eleanor trying to escape. Accounts suggest she was disguised as a man, riding toward the French border, attempting to reach the protection of the French king's territory. Henry Plantagenet's forces intercepted her. They brought her back, and Henry Plantagenet looked at his queen, the woman who had just tried to overthrow him, who had turned his sons into weapons, who had nearly destroyed his kingdom. And he made a decision. He didn't execute her. He couldn't. Eleanor of Aquitaine was too powerful to kill. She controlled Aquitaine by inheritance, not by his permission. Kill her, and the territory went to her heirs, potentially out of English control entirely. Killing her would have cost him everything. So instead, Henry Plantagenet did something that he believed was worse. He locked her away. The exact locations of Eleanor's imprisonment shifted over the years. Winchester, Sarum, various royal castles across England. But the conditions were consistent. Comfortable enough that she couldn't claim cruelty. Isolated enough that she was politically dead. No court, no visitors without Henry Plantagenet's permission. No correspondence that wasn't read and controlled. No way to touch the levers of power that she'd spent 50 years learning to operate. Henry Plantagenet believed he had solved the Eleanor problem. He had removed her from the board. He had silenced the most dangerous political mind in Europe. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. Because here is what Henry Plantagenet didn't understand about Eleanor of Aquitaine. She had been navigating male power since she was 15 years old. She had survived the French court, a crusade, a marriage to a king who had her physically dragged out of a city. She had built an empire, raised kings, and orchestrated a multinational revolt from a provincial court in southern France. A tower wasn't going to stop her. It was going to teach her patience. Eleanor had always been fast, brilliant, and direct, 15 years in prison turned her into something more dangerous, strategic, willing to wait, willing to let the world arrange itself exactly the way she needed it to be arranged. And from inside those walls, she worked. The full extent of what Eleanor accomplished during her imprisonment is deliberately obscured in the historical record, because Henry Plantagenet controlled the record. But the edges of it are visible to anyone who looks. Messengers moved. Letters traveled. Her sons still listened to her. Richard the Lionheart, in particular, maintained a loyalty to his mother that Henry Plantagenet never fully extinguished. Visitors came and went from her various prisons, ostensibly for approved reasons, carrying things back and forth that Henry Plantagenet's guards either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Eleanor built a network from inside 4 stone walls because she had spent a lifetime building networks. And networks, unlike armies, don't require you to be present in a room. Meanwhile, Henry Plantagenet's world was collapsing around him. Henry the young king died in 1183. The son he'd kept as a puppet king, dead of fever during another rebellion. Geoffrey died in 1186, trampled in a tournament. 2 sons gone. Richard the Lionheart, his most powerful remaining son, was growing more independent, more hostile, more openly allied with Philip Augustus of France, who had a genius for exploiting English weakness. Henry Plantagenet watched his empire fracture from the outside, while his most brilliant political ally rotted in a tower by his own command. He had locked away the one person who understood his sons well enough to hold them in line. In 1188, Richard the Lionheart formally allied with Philip Augustus against his own father. The final war between Henry Plantagenet and his remaining sons had begun. Henry Plantagenet, now aging, ill, militarily outmaneuvered, was forced to retreat again and again. Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionheart took city after city, and then came the betrayal that broke him completely. When Henry Plantagenet finally received the list of those who had conspired against him, the names of those who had sided with Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus, the first name on the list was John Lackland, his youngest son, his favorite, the son he had given everything to in preference over Richard the Lionheart. John Lackland had betrayed him. Henry Plantagenet died on July 6, 1189, beaten, humiliated, abandoned by the last son he trusted, sick and broken in a French castle. Some accounts say his final word when he heard John Lackland's name on that list was simply, "Enough." He'd held Eleanor in prison for 15 years, and it had cost him everything. Because the sons he'd failed to manage, Richard the Lionheart's ambition, John Lackland's treachery, the alliances that bled him dry, all of it traced back to a woman in a tower who had more patience than he had power. Richard the Lionheart became king the moment Henry Plantagenet died, and one of his first acts, before the coronation, before the military planning, before the administrative machinery of the kingdom was reorganized, was to free his mother. Eleanor of Aquitaine walked out of prison at approximately 67 years old. She had been locked away for 15 years, and she emerged, not broken, not diminished, not the ghost of the queen she'd been. She emerged ready to work. Richard the Lionheart gave her formal authority over England while he prepared for the Third Crusade. She governed, again, at 67, as if the 15 years had been a pause, not a punishment. What Eleanor did in the years after her release is almost incomprehensible in its scope. She traveled across Europe, negotiating Richard the Lionheart's ransom when he was captured by the Holy Roman Emperor, riding through winter across the Alps in her late 60s to deliver 150,000 marks of silver and secure her son's freedom. She traveled to Spain to personally select and escort her granddaughter Blanche of Castile to marry the French crown prince, a diplomatic journey she undertook at 78 years old. When John Lackland's claim to the English throne was threatened after Richard the Lionheart died, it was Eleanor who held Anjou, who shored up the borders, who moved fast enough to keep the empire from collapsing before John Lackland could stabilize it. She was still working at 80 years old, still writing letters, still negotiating, still understanding with that precise and patient intelligence she developed over 8 decades of navigating power, exactly which lever needed to be pulled, when, and by whose hand. The woman Henry Plantagenet had locked in a tower to silence had spent 15 years becoming quieter and more dangerous, and when the door opened, she walked out and spent the next 30 years proving that he had failed completely. Eleanor of Aquitaine died in 1204. She was approximately 82 years old. She outlived Henry Plantagenet by 15 years. She outlived Richard the Lionheart by 5. She watched 2 of her sons wear the crown of England and personally shaped the circumstances that put both of them there. She is buried at Fontevraud Abbey in France, beside Henry Plantagenet because medieval politics demanded it, and beside Richard the Lionheart because she chose it. The tomb effigy shows her with a book, not a crown, not a scepter, a book open in her hands, as if even in stone, she is still reading, still planning, still thinking about what comes next. Henry Plantagenet thought he understood power. He had armies, he had castles, he had keys. He thought those things defined control. Eleanor understood something he never did. Power isn't what you hold in your hand. It's what you build in other people, in her sons, in her allies, in the network of loyalty and obligation she spent a lifetime constructing. You can lock that in a tower. You cannot stop it. You can take away her court, her throne, her freedom. You cannot take away the fact that every king who mattered in the second half of the 12th century was either her son, her ally, or afraid of her. Henry Plantagenet locked Eleanor in a tower because he thought she was the threat. He was right. He just didn't understand that the tower was never going to be enough. The most dangerous political mind in medieval Europe didn't need a throne. She didn't need an army. She didn't even need a room with a view. She just needed time. And he gave her 15 years of it. Now you know why they tried to keep her quiet, and why it never worked quiet.